We are now going to be switching over to something completely different, as Monty Python would say, looking at the identity of the Yooper. And so I would like Hillary Burton to join us. I see that she's here, that she turns on her camera and her microphone. While she's waiting to do that, this session will feature Hillary and myself. Hillary is going to present first. Her talk is on images of the Yooper, stereotypes from inside and out. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about Hilary, who is a good friend of mine. Dr. Hillary Virtanen is Assistant Professor of Finnish and Nordic Studies at Finlandia University in Hancock. A folklorist and ethnologist by training, Virtanen has researched many aspects of Upper Peninsula and Finnish American folk life, including festivals, traditional arts, gender stereotypes, and folk music. And with NMU Emeritus Sociology Professor Michael Lokinen, she is working on a series of films about Finnish American traditional culture in the UP. She also has published research on folklore characters Heikki Lunta and St. Urho, Finnish American folk music, and World War I anti-war activities. So Hillary, welcome to the Sonderegger Symposium, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, hi, thank you. And Eric, I'm sorry that my picture was visible as I entered the room. I hate that, I'm so sorry. So am I able to share a screen?
Yeah, just go down to share screen and you should be able to do that.
Okay, I don't have that permission.
Oh, they were supposed to give everyone permission.
Oh, I knew this was going to happen. I'm like the jinx of doing papers. I don't necessarily need it. I mean, you know, there's just kind of pictures so people have something to look at other than me, but I can always just talk.
Well, I will try to figure that out because it should be enabled. I'm going to use it as well. So why don't you start talking and I'm going to get that going.
Okay. Yeah. So images of the Yooper, stereotypes from the inside now. The first thing I want to say is I don't want my paper to be like the full 20 minutes because I do want time for people to actually talk about stereotypes and to talk about the things that Dan and I both bring up in our talks. And so, you know, hopefully I'm a fast talker, so I'll do like 15 minutes. So flannel shirts, swampers, choppers, and a chook. A thick Northwoods accent blending several European immigrant patois with the English language that creates the common ground for communication. An ability to make do with a little and to repair nearly all that is broken with duct tape. A tendency toward a rough, stoic masculinity. A love for hunting, fishing, and anything that will let a person explore the forests, rivers, and lakes. And tons of drinking. And euchre. Add these and other basic elements up, and you have a working, stereotypical image of the common Yooper. Yooperus michiganensis. Since the first settlers entered the homelands of the Upper Peninsula's Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Odawa peoples, common factors of life in this remote area have led to the development of a regional culture, and along with it, typified images of the people of the UP, which are cast alternately in both positive and negative lights. The Yooper stereotype exists in dialogue with neighboring groups, the Canucks of Canada, Wisconsin's Cheeseheads, the Flatlanders, Northwoods people of Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Canada, and often most significantly, the Trolls of Upper Michigan, or Lower Michigan. Each of these groups has a set of stereotypes of their own, which are used in dialogue with the stereotypes of the others. Often, being a member of any of these groups has no particular bearing on the moment currently being lived. It is only when an interaction with or socially relevant reference to these groups is made that their stereotypes, both positive and negative, are enacted and enlivened. The folklorized tension between the Upper and Lower Peninsulas is especially well documented by folklorists as well as the folk themselves. James P. Leary illustrates how the geography of the UP is a source of pride for residents when he describes the common reference to the UP as superior land, in sly juxtaposition to its lower and implicitly inferior counterpart. Despite the many amenities life in Lower Michigan may bring, including greater economic opportunities, referring to Lower Peninsula residents, trolls, as living below the bridge, to suggest playfully that residents of Michigan's more populous and wealthy territory nonetheless reside in a kind of hell. Leary notes that even efforts to characterize Yoopers as uncouth backwoods louts, similar to Southern Appalachian hillbillies, are reversed by Yoopers themselves as points of pride, celebrating positive qualities of earthiness, endurance, and self-sufficiency. The anthropologist Thomas Hilland Eriksson offers a good working definition of a stereotype when he says that the concept of stereotyping refers to the creation and consistent application of standardized notions of the cultural distinctiveness of a group. Social psychologists Craig McGarty, Vincent Iserbit, and Russell Spears state that stereotypes have three key functions: First, by aiding the explanation of an individual's behavior by characterizing them into a like group. Second, by creating categories, stereotypes can function to save time and energy in attempting to understand behaviors and perceived traits of an individual. And finally, stereotypes themselves are just beliefs shared by a group. When a group has determined a set of traits and behaviors that they consider to be representative of a group, they themselves are participating in a cultural dialogue of their own by sharing and reflecting on these images. Stereotypes, once created, have a lasting power that allows them to continue to be a tool for social dialogue, both positive and negative. As the folklorist Alan Dundas has stated, describing slurs and stereotypes in folk comparisons of ethnicity and national character, folklore provides a sizable body of materials documenting these stereotypes and national character, including ethnocentrism, prejudice, imagery, and humor. Writing over 3 decades ago, Dundas was able to document oral folklore, including jokes, proverbs, and songs, and visual folklore, including gestures, drawn characters, and the late 20th century phenomenon of photocopy humor. Many of these genres are employed to describe and illustrate the Yooper stereotype, but since the late 1990s, internet-based folklore, especially including memes, have helped to carry these images into the next millennium. There is no reason to expect that these images will die soon. So what all can we include in the Yooper stereotype, and where do these images come from? Even the earliest reports of the Upper Peninsula and its people feature countless depictions of a remote wilderness that had few residents save the indigenous communities sprinkled across the area. Over time, the wildness of the region was shifted by industry, which didn't stop it from being wild in a different way. In this case, a combination of copper and iron mining, as well as logging. Though, like much of the Northwoods, the Upper Peninsula's forests were largely cut down in the logging industry, the continued presence of a forest and the rapid regrowth after being cut over ensured that hunting and gathering could help to feed a family when what they planted in the ground or purchased with meager wages did not suffice. Louis C. Raymond, in his memoir of growing up around Iron River, recalls that the forest was an important source of food for locals during the Depression of 1893, when there was no relief organized, there was no welfare. Priced out of operations, the lumber camp bosses gave the men seed potatoes and the ground on which to plant them. The people killed deer for meat and fished the streams. This pattern of mixed survival strategies proved to be useful to striking laborers, 1930s depression-starved families, and even underpaid workers in the present, maintaining a symbolic and sometimes real emphasis on self-sufficiency, along with persistent poverty, which are certainly hallmarks of the Yooper stereotype today. Yoopers, because of our situation in a rural, remote, wild location, are portrayed as being, much like the people of the Ozarks, the Appalachians, and the Bayou country, simple, perhaps ignorant subpolar rednecks or hillbillies. Characterizations of distinct rural folk groups such as these also include a strong post-immigrant music, foodways, dialects, and other folkways. The folklorist Richard Dawson, in his nearly scriptural book on UP folklore, Bloodstoppers and Bearwalkers, differentiates between himself, one of the book-learned, from Yoopers, one of the tradition-oriented sectors of society, in describing his 1946 journey to a pre-Mackinac Bridge UP. He finds, as other folklorists before and after him, local to the region and far-flung, that the UP does have a remarkable folk life drawn from dozens of ethnic, religious, occupational, and other social folk communities. The stereotype of the self-sufficient forest dweller influences gendered stereotypes of the Yooper. As a college student in Ann Arbor, I worked in a restaurant which was in the process of being sold to a guy from Detroit. He came in one winter day to talk with my boss, and as I waited near the bar for some drinks to be prepared for customers, I got to listen to him brag about a recent snowmobiling trip he had taken to the UP. He spoke in the brash, touristy tone of someone who didn't really find the UP to be, as TV6 calls it, someplace special, but rather a place to go for cheap lodging, fast snowmobiles, and other earthly pleasures not found in the city. He stood directly in front of me at the bar, blocking me from my drinks I needed to retrieve, and told my mild-mannered boss about taking a snowmobile at 80 miles an hour. Then, he said, and at the bar that night, we met the only 2 real women in the whole UP. My eyes flashed sparks that nearly burnt his expensive parka, and I shoved him in the back with my drink tray as I spit out, "Hey, Joey, I'm a real woman from the UP." Images of Yooper women paint us consistently in a masculine light, whether we actually are or not. Yooper women are the descendants of Indigenous and immigrant women who had to work hard in a harsh environment. These were the women who joined their husbands in labor actions against unscrupulous mining companies. They wrangled enough food together from gardens and thickets to survive the brutal winters. Some early reports of Finnish immigrants to the area even claimed that sometimes a Finnish woman would serve as the draft power on an old-fashioned plow. people would actually go by finished farms and see a woman plowing the field herself. These tough traits have vestiges in the present day. Many Yooper women do go hunting and fishing. I'm going fishing tomorrow. We chop and stack wood. We do wear layers of clothing more functional than fashionable when it is cold. The lead singer of De Yoopers, Hillary de Care, gives a vivid description of the ideal Yooper woman, which adds layers to the stereotype and also provides a glowing picture of why such a woman is indeed an object of beauty and desire. There are certain attributes that a Yooper guy looks for in a woman when he decides to give up the single life and get hitched. Can she rebuild a pickup truck motor? Does she know how to run and maintain a snowblower? When you fart, does she give you a high five and say, "Good one"? Will she help you hoist up your buck on a buck pole without complaining? Contrasting with Huli's clear love and admiration for a Yooper woman, emblematic of much of the stereotype, is the negative image of the snow cow. This term in general refers to females from the upper Midwest, with the UP often being emblemized as their home turf, who often, due to the harsh, depressing winters, are extremely pale and overweight. This named stereotype exists in spoken tradition among males from outside of the area, including winter tourists and students in area universities. This image, combined with imagery including out-of-date or unstylish haircuts, minimal makeup, and the wearing of typically masculine clothes, including plaid flannel and camouflage, make Yooper women into a unilaterally undesirable caricature to outsiders. In its most crude representation, the snow cow can even be portrayed as good for an anonymous one-night stand and not much else. The unifying factor in gendered representation is the idea that men and women are both very masculine in the UP, and that as a result, they can be seen participating in the same masculine activities, such as hunting and fishing, that both are capable of hard work, often associated with men in other regions, that women have the same stereotyped ability to drink that men do, and that their official uniform is essentially the same, with little to no distinction being made between what a man will wear and what a woman will wear. In exploring the idealized, authentic speakers of regional dialects in rural areas of the US and Canada, linguist Catherine Remlinger draws a connection between idealized speakers and gender. In looking at distinct rural groups, including Yoopers, Cajuns, and residents of Appalachia and Newfoundland, she concludes that media representations of idealized speakers and authentic locals maintain gender-based language stereotypes. Attitudes linking language use and masculinity are the basis for descriptions of regional speakers and their language use, characterizations of stock characters, and themes in folk humor, as well as activities of authentic Yoopers. Men are the prominent characters and representations of Upper Peninsula stereotypes. They're the Heiki and Aino and Toivo of our named jokes they are the named characters in our regional jokes. They're the ones who are ascribed with notable deeds and stories, like Heiki Lunta. They're the ones whose characters, real and assumed, permeate the entire image of the Yooper. The aspect of language, then, is also a key feature of the Yooper stereotype. The Yooper dialect is perhaps one of the best known and most commented upon features of our image. It is true that for many, the natural dialect and word usage makes it clear that one is a Yooper. For speakers of the UP dialect, a trip to other places can highlight just how unique our words and sounds are, as we might say things like chuk, sauna, pasty, and more. The dialect, like many forms of speech, carries with it assumptions about socioeconomic and educational status. And when a Yooper is heard by a neighboring group member or someone else who has any level of familiarity, it marks a person instantly and may even make them the subject of teasing, lighthearted or otherwise. Our dialect itself, like other aspects of our folk culture, is a blend of English with words and sounds, word orders, and sentence structure features that come from a number of languages, including Ojibwe, German, French, via Canada, and most notably Finnish. As Catherine Remlinger notes in her excellent book, Yooper Talk, the dialect is an important part of identity formation and maintenance for Yoopers. Additionally, it is something that may cause individual speakers to consider whether it is beneficial or detrimental to the speaker, because it marks one as a Yooper and makes one susceptible to the enlivenment of stereotypes upon them. For some, like me, using the dialect can be situational. Right now, I'm talking like some academic from somewhere bland and neutral. But if you catch me with my grandma or with some elders around the community, or if my kids get me really mad, you'll hear my Yooper words and sounds quite clearly. Stereotypes of the Yooper also live on in many other minor ways. Drinking has been mentioned without much comment throughout this paper, but certainly the stereotype of Yoopers as participating in a strong drinking culture is something we share with our neighbors to the south, the Cheeseheads. Both men and women are considered to be practitioners of this art, and at least before the advent of our excellent craft breweries that dot our region, Old Milwaukee and Labatt's were among the stereotype drinks of choice. A strong and persistent stereotype exists that Yoopers are hard workers. This is one of the few stereotypes that can't be seen in both negative and positive lights, unless you consider that in some cases, another facet of the stereotype is that we are docile as workers and can take poor treatment and maybe even poor pay, which is negative for us, right? Stories of hardworking Yoopers and their ability to find work as a result outside of the area are quite common and have been shared for decades. Yoopers, though often considered to be suspicious of outsiders, are also considered to be incredibly kind. I imagine most of us here have a story about a Yooper who helped us or others people in some extraordinary way. I've seen so many letters to the editor of Houghton's Daily Mining Gazette describing the prompt return of a wallet full of cash or an expensive piece of jewelry lost on the beach that I actually consider it to be a written genre. It is where, if your car breaks down, someone is going to help you. However, you know about our property without your broken down truck clearly behind you, we're going to treat you with suspicion until you prove you're not worthy of it. So the stereotypes come to life most commonly in these situations where interpersonal contact makes it come out. Sometimes it is found in jokes, songs, and play acting. It is found when Yoopers find themselves with a neighboring group and this identity is brought to light. It is found when two Yoopers find each other somewhere far away and try to assess the Yooperness of the other. In these moments, Yoopers may be enlivening the stereotypes of themselves and the other. Images of cheeseheads, trolls, flatlanders, fudgies, tech toots, transplants, and themselves, the Yoopers, dance in their brains as they plot the course for continuing their action, whether in jest or in seriousness. Stereotypes also take place in areas where interpersonal interaction may not be direct in the moment, but where it may take place later as a result. This includes internet memes, recorded music, and films such as Escanaba and De Moonlight. Watching the film itself may be a completely solitary act, but it allows the viewer, Yooper or otherwise, to have more materials with which to engage the stereotypes later. In the end, stereotypes are a fraught cultural tool. In their worst extreme, they are used to justify genocide and oppression, and in their best intended extreme, they are used to highlight the positive features of a given individual by utilizing supposed features of a group to which they belong. While for some, a kernel of truth is considered to exist at the heart of a given stereotype, for others, they are entirely useless in their dealings with other people. Either way, stereotypes have been a common cognitive device used by humans since we're all hunter-gatherers, and they will continue to be an interesting part of our social lives and worthy of our better understanding of them. Thank you.
Fantastic, Hillary. And I'm really glad because it's setting me up perfectly for my talk. If you have a question for Hillary, there is a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. Click on that, type in your question. We are going to field those at the end. I will speak for another 20 minutes, and then we will have 15 to 20 minutes of Q&A. So I hope you'll have some questions for us, or otherwise Hillary and I will just wrap for 20 minutes. So let me get on with my presentation, which is on the identity of the Yooper. And I'm going to pull up my PowerPoint here. All right. Can you see that? All right. So a few weeks ago, I posed the following question on Facebook. Where does up north begin? It started a wonderful thread answered by family and friends of mine, both from above and below the bridge, showing the vast differences in perspective among people who grew up in the Great Lakes state. For most UP-born residents, the up north begins at the bridge. However, for some of them, that wasn't far enough north. Some claimed that you weren't up north until you got to Munising or the western UP, and some felt that the Keweenaw was where up north begins. One smart aleck wrote, Canada. Those who live or grew up downstate, the answers were much more different. As a kid who grew up in Flushing, Michigan, the small town outside of Flint, up north begins at that invisible magical line that crosses the lower peninsula somewhere around Standish on I-75 or Clare on M127. And that's me on the right at the Clare Visitor Center back in the early 1970s. After that, the forests get thicker and the lakes more numerous, and along with the campgrounds and recreational facilities that one associates with the north. For others, Gaylord is the gateway to the north, which makes sense because it's right on the 45th parallel, which by definition is technically the beginning of north. When I lived in Traverse City, people would often use the term up north to describe its location. And when I'd remind them that the UP was further north, they'd say, no, that's the UP, meaning that it was its own separate thing. It only reinforced the feeling that so many people in the UP and the lower peninsula have, that the two peninsulas are a place separated by more than geography, and that the Mackinac Bridge had not entirely brought them together like so many had hoped or feared it would. And that gets to the point of my thesis today, is that there is a perceived difference between Yoopers and trolls that is very ingrained in our public consciousness, but maybe is more superficial than some believe, where I will base my theory on actual examples. Actually, I would say that Hilary did that much better than I will do. It would also be reinforced by my personal experiences as a transplant Yooper. So what does that mean? A transplant Yooper is a person who grew up somewhere other than the UP, then moved there later in life and adopted the place as their home. The term is used very regularly in the region because someone who lives in the UP but who is not born here would be wise to hesitate calling themselves a Yooper. That is not because they don't identify with the place or the lifestyle, but because to the residents of the UP, a true Yooper has to have been born and raised here. Now, with that said, increasingly you do see people embracing the Yooper mantle who were not born here. One glaring example was when our U.S. Representative Jack Bergman claimed Yooper identity in his election signs, where he has been given a pass by his supporters. In truth, many people were offended. Not only was he not born in the UP, he didn't grow up here, didn't move to the UP until after retirement from the military when he bought a cottage near Waters Meet. Is embracing that title for your average Yooper is a sin on par with pronouncing sauna or pasty, or mispronouncing sauna or pasty, if not worse. But Jack Bergman is not the only person who was claimed to be a Yooper who, like me, are actually transplant Yoopers. However, for the most part, these are people who either came here at a young age or after moving here entirely embraced the place and its way of life. Individuals like this are often bestowed with the title of honorary Yooper, which is a step above transplant in the hierarchy because it confers that actual Yoopers have accepted you as one of their own. While working in this presentation, I was discussing these concepts with a friend of mine who is a true Yooper. She said that her husband and her have created a ceremony to baptize honorary Yoopers, which involves a sauna, swampers, which are winter boots, and choppers, leather winter gloves. She also said there is another type called super Yooper, which she defines as a transplant who knows more about the UP and lives a life more truly than a true Yooper. But in all honesty, none of this is really true. What makes a Yooper, regardless of birthright, is how one embraces the Yooper lifestyle, if there really is such a thing. What is this lifestyle? Hilary in her presentation has listed many of the attributes and stereotypes of the Yooper from outside and within. But from my own perspective, I see that being a Yooper is about values towards land, its use, and one's own relationship with it. Yooper is someone who has an abiding love of the outdoors. This is pretty much mandatory since much of our lives are spent outdoors, but whether we want it or not. But when I mean outdoors, I don't just mean walking down the street. I mean in the woods, on the beach, on the trail, on a lake, in a campground, or maybe just riding around some lonesome highway for no other reason than just to do it. These are aspects of Yooper life that are essential to living here and embracing the place. Some people would say that being a Yooper means that you like to hunt or fish. Well, I take issue with this because number one, people love to hunt and fish in the Lower Peninsula and much of the Upper Midwest as much as the UP. Now, Yoopers are certainly proud of their sportsman lifestyle, and certainly it is an ever-present part of our lives. But to love and engage in these activities is hardly unique to our region or lifestyle. However, more than many other places, one's engagement or lack of engagement in these activities does mark you as being a real Yooper versus a non-Yooper, even if you were born here. Now, I was born in Muskegon in the Lower Peninsula and grew up outside of Flint, but my father took us on many family fishing, hunting, and skiing trips in the Lower Peninsula. Granted, we had to drive a lot further than up here, but it was part of our lives. And after we moved to the UP when I was 11, well, they did become a bigger part of my life. And though camp culture, of course, is very important to the UP way of life. And though we didn't have one of our own, we were welcome to join my uncle's camp for deer hunting season. I grew up deer, bird, and rabbit hunting as a teenager in the Western UP. However, in college, I didn't have much time to pursue hunting anymore. And honestly, I never really enjoyed it. I loved being in the woods and even tracking animals, but I never really wanted to shoot anything. Frankly, I didn't like having the power of a firearm in my hands and was frightened by the damage I could do with it. So I gave up hunting. So strike one against me as a real Yooper. And this is my uncle in the middle at his camp. My father's there on his right. The same with fishing. I did it as a kid with my dad, but never got the bug. I haven't fished in decades. So strike two against me being a real Yooper. But I do love the outdoors. I love to hike, bike, snowshoe, and ski. I love foraging for mushrooms and berries in the forest and long walks on the beaches of the Great Lakes. I love canoeing on its rivers and lakes and have camped in most of the UP's state and national parks. So I think I've reached first base on the Yooper chart. As I mentioned before, one has to know how to pronounce sauna and pasty. But not only that, as a Yooper, one is obligated to point out the proper pronunciation when someone who is not a Yooper says them incorrectly. In addition, one's value as a Yooper is greatly enhanced if they can tell that person about the correct origin of the pasty and the difference between the Cornish and Finnish version, where the best one can be bought and the only acceptable condiment one can use on a pasty, ketchup. Now, I've made it to second base, and I was headed third, but I had to go back when I revealed that my favorite condiment on pasties is sriracha. Now, many years ago, a friend of mine from Washington State asked me how we could survive the winters in the UP. And I told him that you had to learn to embrace winter. It is true that we who live here have to do that. And in fact, some Yoopers will claim that they love winter. Some will say it is even their favorite season. I do love many winter activities, including skiing and snowshoeing. Where I have to admit that once March comes around, I've had enough. And I'm looking forward to a time when I can leave the UP for a month or two to escape the mud season, or as we know it, end of winter, sort of spring. However, the truth is that many Yoopers hate winter. The difference is that they know how to endure it and do so because of the benefits of living here the rest of the year. There's also a pride in being able to do it, so it is a mark of a true Yooper. So though I don't always like it, I have the sisu necessary to pull it off. But surviving winter is hardly a Yooper trait. I spent enough time in Duluth and Traverse City to see conditions as bad as anything in the Yoop, and people embracing it as well. The snowfall in upstate New York can equal that to any lake effect storm in Lake Superior. And the 3 winters I spent in Iowa, which are just cold, windy, and wet, confirm me that winter can sometimes suck everywhere. And in the end, it's a state of mind. But how important the land and climate is to the UP is really key to the Yooper identity. We carry our ability to endure difficult conditions as a badge of honor. Whether it is shoveling 3 feet of snow or wading through a mosquito-infested swamp in July, it isn't that we love these things, it's that we've adapted to them to live a certain lifestyle. However, I would claim that as more people move to the UP from outside the region or come back to live here after many years away, that lifestyle is changing. More and more people are embracing quiet sport activities that don't include shooting or catching something. Camp life is still important, but most people can't afford to buy a camp or don't have the skills to build one themselves. Mountain biking, ice climbing, ATV riding, and other recreational activities are becoming more and more popular. The land has also become a contentious issue and one that some would say separates the true Yooper from the wannabe. When the Eagle Mine was being developed in northern Marquette County, I heard it stated many times that those who wanted the mine were locals who appreciated our mining history and heritage, and those against were invariably transplant environmentalists who don't appreciate Yooper values. Where Yoopers have a deep, unabiding love for nature, wilderness, and conservation, there's also a flip side of the identity that appreciates the importance of extraction industries such as mining and logging, not only to our economy, but our culture. It is true that most of our communities would not exist if it were not for these industries. But is this belief in extraction industries truly monolithic in the Yooper identity? With the declining amount of jobs in mines and woods across the peninsula, there are new Yoopers that do not have these same allegiances as previous generations. In fact, there is a growing Yooper identity tied to environmentalism and the protection of wild places that is homegrown and not just a product of outsiders settling in the region. One area where I see a change in this idea is with regards to cultivation and the foraging of land. There's a growing interest in participation in making the most of the bounty that the US or the UP's forests provide, such as mushrooms and berries and medicinal plants. Where 20 years ago, your average Yooper wouldn't have known what chaga was, this is now part of the growing vocabulary. The love of foraging for mushrooms like chanterelles and morels or berries is something enjoyed far and wide, and is a characteristic we definitely share with our neighbors downstate and in Wisconsin. Of course, the thimbleberry is something that Yoopers hold dear because of the concentrations that grow here and the fact that they are so darn tasty. Knowing what a thimbleberry is and where to pick them has become as Yooper as knowing how to shovel snow. Food, of course, is one of those things that defines and connects people, and the UP is no different. I grew up eating pasties as a boy in the Lower Peninsula, but it was because my parents were exiled Yoopers who brought the recipe with them. I learned very early in life that ketchup was acceptable, but that gravy was something that only trolls put on their pasties. Honestly, I like gravy on them, but it's not something you are likely to see in the UP. The UP, of course, has a growing number of food items that have become synonymous with the place, such as kudigi, nissu or puya bread, yustawa or squeaky cheese, korpu, known as trinary toast locally, smoked whitefish, and a bunch of, we got potato sausage there as well. And also a bunch of restaurants in the UP that have their own spin on American favorites. There's the Yooper Italian food that you have in each region is very different from Italian food you might have in any other part of the country. And knowing these things is a sure sign that you are a Yooper or a transplant Yooper. It's also a sign that you probably suffer from diabetes as well, like I do personally. And it is an issue in the Yooper identity that all the foods that we love and endure and endeared themselves to us are usually not very good for our diets. And something maybe we need to look at in our identity and our change in the future, for better or for worse. There's also a growing embrace of the trappings of urbanity that are becoming more common in our communities. Increasingly, people are becoming more particular about the food they eat, beer and wine they drink, clothes they wear, and products they purchase. Hilary mentioned this earlier of being a Yooper, Old Milwaukee and Labatt's, and I would add Blatz were the drink of choice of Yoopers 30 years ago. Today, Yoopers love craft beer, and we see craft breweries popping up around the UP just like they have all over the country. And yes, drinking is a part of the identity of the Yooper. Unfortunately, I no longer drink, so that has definitely dropped me from the ranks of being a true Yooper because I no longer drink beer, but I have good reasons for that. But anyway, people are much more particular about the clothes that they wear and the products they purchase. The rise of consumer culture with which the Yooper's nature and isolation once kept largely at bay has arrived and is changing our urban landscape. Where your average Yooper once wouldn't have been caught dead visiting a city larger than Green Bay, now look forward to their annual vacations in Minneapolis, Chicago, or New York to soak in the trappings of the city. Where I appreciate the UP's isolation, I have to admit that at times I miss living in and near a metropolitan area. Maybe that's a sign that I'm not a true Yooper, honorary or otherwise. But I think that there is an increasing number of Yoopers who can identify with this sentiment. In truth, the depth of Yooper identity is vast and complex, and not nearly as simplistic as the stereotypes suggest. Like the rest of the world, as technology breaks down the walls of understanding about other perspectives, the new Yooper is better educated and aware of the world beyond the region's borders. It is also true that we find many of the things that Yoopers value, such as a true connection to land and its protection, are not simply a Yooper value. The trappings of the Yooper lifestyle is found in many places in the North Woods of Michigan and Wisconsin and Minnesota, and not to mention Canada. At the same time, the national trends that often pass out of the way places like the UP now flow freely into our world through the internet and the media. The UP may seem like a place apart and far away from the world, but increasingly this separation is merely geographic. Of course, one area where the identity for Yoopers is still strong is in our accents and dialects. And that is a big topic unto itself. And as Hilary mentioned, if you want to read more about this, Kate Remlinger's book, Yooper Talk, is an excellent place to start. And what I would say too is that Yooper, there is not one Yooper accent. There are many Yooper accents. Anybody who has spent a lot of time traveling between parts of the UP, whether it be the Keweenaw or Sault Ste. Marie or Iron River or Menominee, will hear various takes on the Yooper accent. What I attribute that to is really the ethnic makeup of those communities. Some communities are much more Finnish, some are more German, some are more Canadian. And all of these really do affect the various differences in the dialect, but there is definitely a dialect and an accent that we have here, and Kate's book is an excellent place to start. But also that we identify with that now. There was a time when we did not identify with it, where it was seen as something that was a bad thing, and my own mother would oftentimes chastise us for using certain words and speaking in a certain way. It is also true that we are connected with the outside world, and the patterns of speaking that I grew up with in the Western UP may be starting to change and disappear. Growing up, my first 11 years in Southeast Michigan certainly impacted the way I speak. A cross between the nasal lower Michigan accent combined with 70s hipster speak that we picked up from our older siblings. Whenever we visited our family in the UP, we were always taken with the difference between the way we spoke and our cousins. And when we moved to Wakefield in 1978, it was even stranger because the accent and dialect in the Western UP was thicker than Marquette or the Sioux. There were certain phrases and words we didn't understand, and the accents of the old timers were almost indecipherable. My mother, who had grown up in Munising, but who had worked hard to lose her UP accent, she was an English teacher, was horrified when after a few weeks we were already using terms like "a" at the end of our sentences. To her, the Yooper accent was a sign of unsophistication, and if she thought it would get in the way of us speaking and communicating properly. I never have had a true full Yooper accent, though when I visit other places, people will laugh if I use a word or say something in a particular way. So in the end, maybe that means that I'm not a true Yooper, in that I don't really speak like one. But as American speech becomes more homogenized, maybe none of us will be able to use speech as a form of identity as it has been in the past. Just as everyone has an accent, all accents are changing. And just as accents do, the identity of the Yooper is changing with each decade. We are becoming more diverse in race and ethnicity, more knowledgeable and interested in the world outside our borders, and more American all the time. So that is the end of my talk. We have about 20 minutes before the next session begins. And we do have some questions here. And so the first question here is from Margaret. She asks, what classifies someone as a Yooper? Is it residency or the length of residency? So Hilary, how do you have an answer for that?
So I guess the stereotypical answer that a lot of people, I mean, I'm a 4th and 5th generation Yooper on all sides of my family. If you need to birth her on me, my birth certificate says Hancock. So, but I would say the stereotypical answer is that you do have to be born in the UP. But I would disagree with that because I've certainly seen people, as your paper highlights, there are people who enjoy things that are kind of typified as being the Yooper lifestyle, and having this connection to the land is really important. And so there are ways to be a Yooper without having been born here. But I think that it's a lot of times going to end up being in the eye of the beholder. Like, it's always going to be negotiated between the people who are using that identity or sort of assuming that identity at a different moment. So I like to leave it open, right?
Yeah, I don't think there is a time. I mean, residency alone, like I said, I think in the end, there are different layers of Yooperdom. And oftentimes it has to determine it by one's own personal identity and how you view it, and also how it is conferred upon you. And I've had many people now will say to me, and I've said, well, I'm not a real Yooper. Said, oh, by now you are, but I think that's more because of the nature of my work versus my lifestyle always, because there are many aspects of my lifestyle that are not Yooper lifestyle things. And I don't appreciate all the things that are quote unquote Yooper things. So yeah, I think that's the whole point, is that it is varied. It isn't as clear cut as people want it to be. Someone does ask, Maria, does owning a cemetery plot in the UP add to your status? I would say so, especially if you plan to spend eternity here.
Especially if you bought it like before death, maybe, like if it's been a commitment for quite a while. So Margaret's my friend. I should ask if she's planning on being in Liminga Cemetery near my family or where.
Well, I will say from my parents' perspective, they spent the last years of their lives in Duluth. The reason why was because they were able to get the care that they needed there, and have the support of more family than they had in Marquette. But they both, it was a regret of both of them that they knew that they were not going to spend their last days in the UP. But I am happy to say that they both rest in the cemetery here in Marquette today, which was their goal. Kate Remlinger joined us. She did ask if we could say more about the historical roots of the stereotypes and identity. I don't know, do you want to take that, Hilary?
Well, I mean, I guess one of the things that we both talked about in this paper is, or in our papers, is the connection between the land and Yooper identity. So, I mean, you know, folklorists, we can pretty stereotypically go back to this German philosopher from like the late early 1800s named Herder, who suggested that the folk were a combination between the land that they live on, the sort of language and things that the language says, like the kind of customs that language entails, and then the traditions that they practice, and that all together, these three things would create something like a Volksgeist, or sort of like this kind of cultural spirit that community has. And so, you know, I mean, if we want to go back to that sort of cheesy stereotype, sort of folklorist cringy thing, you know, I mean, we still see it in the way that we describe it nowadays. You know, the land is the first thing that we mention as being an important part of the roots of the UP identity. But, you know, I mean, I think that land, work, interethnic kind of interaction are like the three main things that I see as the Yooper sort of identity. Take it away.
No, I agree completely with that. I think that, you know, the historical roots are really in the people. I think that, and we have several sessions this today on Native American history. I think we do not give enough credit to the influence of the Native American people on our culture. Europeans didn't come here and just instantly know how to live in this land. They didn't come here and know how to survive here. You know, certainly they brought their trappings with them, but, you know, they had to learn how to exist in this landscape and this climate. And they received a lot of help going back to the very first Europeans who came here from the Native American people. And so a lot of traits that we have in our culture in the UP, I think, have some roots in the Native American culture. Certainly things were brought with people from Finland and Canada and Germany and Italy, and we have those as parts of our culture. But I like to believe that the Native American history culture has also played a really important role. And I you know, I have to believe that it affected our language in a way too, because if you listen to the speech patterns and the dialects, but the accent of Native American people who grew up in Native American communities, not only in the UP, but in other parts of the United States, you would swear that they were from the upper Midwest.
I would agree with that. Actually, before I haven't lived in the UP my whole life. And when I was younger, I lived for 2 years on the Rosebud Reservation in South Dakota, which is Lakota land. And I was actually very surprised at how many sort of just small little pieces I could see between the way the Lakota friends that I had spoke and people like my grandma and my great grandparents spoke, just little things, but just that kind of, you know, those small things are there. One other thing I would say about the UP identity, is, of course, this term Yooper has only really existed since like the 1970s or so. And so, you know, I mean, there wasn't really that sort of word for describing ourselves. I mean, this word that really is so important to ourselves as Yoopers is, you know, much less than a century old, much less than like 3/4 of a century old. So it's still something that, you know, it's new, but that newness hasn't worn off on us yet, I think.
Yeah, no, that's a really great point. And it's an area of this study that I think needs to be looked at a little bit more, is that impact on our culture. And I know the folks in our Center for Native American Studies have done that work, but there's still a lot more to be done. There was a comment from somebody who says her father used to go to camp with my Uncle Jack, who I featured in my presentation. That is so typically Yooper, that somebody who doesn't know me knows a family member of mine. I always tell people who want to know what the UP is like, I'm like, well, this is something about the UP that if I meet somebody from the UP, I invariably know somebody that they know, and probably a family member. And that's because, we go to college, places like Northern or Tech or Finlandia. We meet people from across the UP, we work with them. And from that, we develop relationships with people from all parts of the Upper Peninsula. And so we have these kind of connections. And I always get comments from people in Newberry that they either had my father or my Uncle Jack for high school math or history, or they were coaches or et cetera. So yeah, my Uncle Jack, I spent a lot of time in his camp on Nebish Island, which is a fantastic place, a very Native American place. Not many deer, but a lot of fun for camp. There is a question from, go ahead.
That family connection too is really important because, one of the stereotypes of Yoopers is that we come from large families. And in some cases that can be, pretty quite correct. I mean, I'm Finnish and French Canadian. And although I'm mostly Finnish, I'm related to more people because the fact that I'm like 1/8 French Canadian than I am because of the Finnish people I'm related to. And so, I mean, it allows for this, if you remember your kinship, either because you're indigenous to here and you've been here, or because your family has been here for over like 100, 150 years and they've stayed here, that creates this network of kinship that's very long. I mean, I can look at people in my community and be like, that's my fifth cousin twice removed. And it'll take me about 5 minutes to figure that specific thing out, but I know that they're a cousin. And so, I mean, it's kind of, I think that that's kind of an important and interesting thing about